I almost want to do this, like turn a little bit this way here. So we have been, for those of you who haven't been able to join us, first of all, welcome. Very glad to have you with us. But for the past 4 weeks, we've been going through a book called Triumphing Over Sinful Fear. It's by a gentleman by the name of John Flavel. And as you could probably infer from the title itself, it's a study on fear and how to fight fear. Fear, how many people have feared here, right? We all fear many times on a daily basis about various things. And the simple objective that we have in going through this book is figuring out how to bring the power of the gospel, use the fear of God or faith in God, trust in God, to fight or triumph over those many fears that we face. Some big, some small. In most cases, they are small fears in actuality that seem quite big in our heads, right? So that's just a very, very high-level overview of what it is that we've been studying. This is a 6-week series, and we are on session 5. We are on the 5th week of a 6-week series. If you want to go back and catch up, feel free to, it's so weird to say, but I guess it's common. Check us out on YouTube. It's just weird for me. I don't know why it's weird to say, but we do have a YouTube channel. Is that right, Lucas? We have a channel of YouTube, a YouTube channel. Oh my goodness. Anyways, go check us out. And the first 4 weeks are on there. So encourage you, if you want to catch up, to go and do that. Now, this week in particular, we are going to be finishing off the discussion we started last week on the causes of what's called sinful fear. Sinful fear being that fear which arises out of our sinful hearts. Okay, so this isn't natural fear in which we, sort of as an alert button, we see a car coming down the road and we're in the middle of the street, danger, danger. We should fear. We should jump out of the way, right? That's natural fear. That's normal fear. That's fear that, in fact, even Jesus had. But the fear that we're talking about now is sinful fear. Fear that essentially takes the place of God on the throne of our hearts. Most common, and Flavel speaks of this most consistently, is a fear of man. What are people going to do to me? How are they going to harm me? And the various manifestations of that, or in fact, giving too much credence to our own opinions as man. Man's opinions are loud, but they're often also godless, right? And we tend to fear those opinions more than we even fear what it is that God says to us. And we should be more concerned with that particular fear. So, and John Flavel, nonetheless, identifies 6 causes of sinful fear. We considered last week 2 of the 6. Does anybody remember what they are? Who were attending last week? Ignorance was one. The other one begins with a G. Feel it all the time. Guilt, yeah. Ignorance and guilt. And in respect to ignorance, Flavel says, remember that sinful fear of most good people arises from their ignorance. If our judgment is properly instructed, our hearts will be at peace. So there's a correlation between our knowledge base, particularly the knowledge of God is found in the scriptures, and the amount that we tend to fear. It's not really hard. Again, if our judgment is properly instructed, that is, if we have right knowledge of God, our hearts will tend to be at peace. And he also discussed 5 other types of ignorance. There's ignorance of God, ignorance of others, ignorance of ourselves, ignorance of circumstances, and of also, and lastly, the covenant of grace. Now, in respect to guilt, Flavel said that a servant of sin is necessarily a slave of fear. Those who commit evil, in other words, must expect evil. The evil man's troubled imagination scares him when there is no real danger. He aggravates small matters, blowing them up to the height of the most destructive evils. He's pessimistic about things that are even doubtful or unlikely. Okay? Now, we have to keep in mind as we walk through these discussions on sinful fear, Flavel is a Puritan. He speaks in oftentimes very black and white terms. Oftentimes when he refers to wicked or evil, he's referring even to the wickedness or the evil or the sin struggles within believers ourselves, in other words. So it isn't to say that if you experience this type of thing where you aggravate small matters, blowing them up to the height of the most destructive evils, basically meaning you're blowing it out of proportion, right? that you're not a Christian. That's not what's being said here. He's saying that we're still, nonetheless, struggle with these destructive evils inside of us. However, a non-Christian would tend to be ruled by these fears. They wouldn't be relieved or remember the promises of God's grace that gives relief and comfort even in the midst of those fears. So we want to be careful to make that distinction. And Flavel also reminded us that some people succumb to these symptoms of fear who are genuine believers for sure, but because of what he calls their physical constitution, they may still suffer these things. Does anybody remember what we talked about, how we defined or how the Puritans and Flavel tend to define a constitution? I'm not talking about our founding documents, right, the United States. What does he mean by constitution? Absolutely. It's like it could be, two things. Our overall physical disposition or the condition of our physical health, right? Or for some people in some cases, just temperaments, personalities, right? Certain personalities and physical makeups tend to be predisposed to this type of fear. And so we want to be careful to make that distinction as well. But a reminder that God, who is good, right, tends to leave even those with these physical or even I would say mental constitutions sort of in this state of wrestling with fears in order to keep us humble. It's very similar to what Paul talks about in the book of either 1st or 2nd Corinthians when he talks about having a thorn in the flesh, right? This thorn that God has placed there. I asked him to get it out of me 3 times, and what's his response? Does anybody remember? Well, he says, no, yeah. But my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. And so there are times when God will leave certain struggles in the lives of believers, even for their entire life perhaps, where he will leave them to wrestle with those things, but making this promise: you're actually going to be better off in your weakness had you not had, right, this particular spiritual strength. And as we know, at the end of the day, we're all here to glorify God and make everything about him and his glory, right? But oftentimes our natural disposition is to make it about us and our glory, right? So the Lord gives us these particular struggles to keep us humble so that he might be made more manifest in us. After all, it is him in us that changes lives, right? He in us brings hope. We don't bring hope in and of ourselves. So that's a review, probably a little bit more in the weeds, but we do have some new people with us this morning. I want to try to catch up a little bit more in the weeds than we usually go to. Now, today we're going to begin to move into the remaining causes of sinful fear, according to Flavel, and then talk about its effects. How does it show itself, right, in our particular lives? And so first we're going to continue with the causes. And the next cause that Flavel identifies as a cause of sinful fear is unbelief. This is section 2A on your outline. Now, Flavel says, if people were to dig to the root of their fears, they would find unbelief. The weaker the faith, the greater the fear. Unbelief generates fear, and fear strengthens unbelief, right? So you have this sort of tragic cycle, this tormenting cycle going on between unbelief and fear. And then he quotes from Matthew 8:26, why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith? And Flavel goes on to speak of 4 ways that unbelief generates fear. And now, for time's sake, however, and because some of the material in some ways is a repeat of what we've already discussed, we're just going to look at one simple way in which unbelief generates fear. Okay, and Flavel says, unbelief makes people careless and negligent in preparing for trouble. So the more surprising evil is, the more frightening it is. He goes on, and this isn't in your outline, but he goes on to tell the story that's relayed by Augustine. You've been hearing his name a lot over the past couple of weeks, especially throughout the study. And Augustine tells this story. It's a story from church history. It's a story about a man named Paulinus, who was a bishop of Nola, a place called Nola. He was, Augustine says, rich in both goods and graces. He had much of the world in his hands, this is Flavel speaking, but little of it in his heart. When the Goths, a barbarous people, sacked his city, they seized the spoils. So they took all the stuff, right? Those who trusted in their measure, that is their measure of material wealth, were ruined. The Goths afflicted them with torture in order to make them tell them where they had hidden their wealth, right? So where'd you hide your gold, right? Where'd you hide your treasures, your silver, whatever? Where is it? And they threatened them under condemnation of their life to tell them where it was, so they can rob them. Okay, and Augustine says that this Nola, this good bishop, fell into their hands. He lost everything, and remember, he was rich in both goods, so material goods and graces. But he lost everything, yet he remained unmoved at the loss. He prayed, Lord, let me not be troubled for my gold and silver. Thou knowest it is not my treasure, that which I have laid up in heaven according to thy command. Thou hast warned of this judgment before it came, and I prepared for it. Thou knowest, Lord, where my interest lies. And so the idea that he's getting at is saying, okay, look, you know, the more that we prepare ourselves, condition ourselves, strengthen our faith, right? We acknowledge the fact that fearful days are going to come in some way, shape, or form. Barbarous people are going to come, even perhaps through our land, or you could even say, from a spiritual perspective, the devil will trounce through the lands of our hearts, right? As a barbarous individual seeking to ransack it. Are we going to acknowledge that reality, and are we going to prepare for it? And as we prepare for it, are we going to put our trust in riches and material wealth? Or are we going to put our trust in God? Right? Are we going to make our investments in spiritual things in addition to material things, or even spiritual things over and against material things at times as well? I want to ask you a question, open this up for discussion. Is anyone bold enough to say how you're preparing for trouble today? We make a lot about the state of the society which surrounds us. We've talked a lot about this over the past 2 years, particularly in respect to society's disposition towards faithful, orthodox, small o Christianity. We make a lot about that society, but how have we prepared for it? And are we preparing for it? Does anybody want to share, if you are at all, how you're preparing for these things?
Like extra food and water on the shelves, stuff like that, maybe some cash.
Okay. Okay, so that's speaking to of the material side of things, right? I'm saving some money, I'm getting some material things together. Okay, so you're stocking up in case there's a material shortage on something. What else? What?
Making sure to have community.
Okay, making sure to have community, right? Strong relationship, a good network, if you will, a good spiritual network. Yeah, very good. Good community, good solid community. Who else, or what else? Okay. Another question. Are there any books of the Bible that speak to how to endure these type of sufferings, or even any historical writings that you know of, not necessarily biblical? I mean, there are. It's kind of a rhetorical question, but which ones maybe is the more specific one? I saw Madison. You had your hand up, and then Wyatt. Madison. Job. Yeah. Right. So, boy, reading the story of Job. What's the central thrust at the end of it all? I mean, what's two things you learned fundamentally from Job? God is sovereign, right? In the end, God doesn't give Job an actual answer to his questions. He never says, hey, here's why, right? He says, here's who I am. And then he goes on to explain his character, right? And Job realizes that's the answer. What's the other thing? I mean,
Maybe construe this better than I'm about to say it. Suffering is guaranteed irrespective of how much faith you have in God.
yeah. So if you're a believer, you're going to suffer. That's true. And did Job experience that suffering to sort of unheard of degrees, right? I mean, he's the guy oftentimes in the Bible, sometimes you think of like, okay, I have a professor that writes this book, The Shadow of Christ, in the book of Job. I would say you could make a really good case that like the Bible doesn't describe such horrific suffering outside of Christ, right? And the implications of his suffering more than Job's, right? This is a man who underwent immense suffering. What happened to Job? Go ahead. Yeah. Why is he suffering? Why is Job so miserable? Yeah, be more granular, be more specific. When we say stuff, be more particular.
All his kids died in a catastrophic house accident.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then like he's getting no support either. Like he doesn't really have an awesome community. His wife's saying, curse God and die, right? That if I'm discouraged, I don't want Julie to say to me, hey dude, give it all up. Like this is it. We're done. And then his friends, are they friends? There's one that gets kind of close. But what do his friends do? They listen and then they're like, shut up. Like you're doing this because this is happening to you because you did wrong, right? Well, there's what you really want to feel in the midst of immense suffering. Hey, buck up. You're sinning, right? It's not necessarily supportive. And also in Job's case, in some sense it's true, but in some sense it's not. It's not a specific thing that's right. So yeah, anyways, a lot of suffering. But the point is that how, in terms of preparation for the day of fear, right, in a spiritual sense, Job is answered not with details, but with the character of God, who he is, right? What else? Let's think New Testament. I mean, the suffering is talked about all the time in the New Testament. There's a particular book or books that are like, hey, this is a manual on suffering. Yeah, yeah. So all of them, except, right? What's that? Yeah, yeah. So Philippians, right? Rejoice in the Lord always. Joy is a constant theme in that book. Union with Christ is a constant theme in that book, right? Remember who you are united to Christ. Rejoice in the Lord always. Here's how you pray when you're anxious, that type of thing. What about the book of First Peter? Yeah, rejoice in your sufferings. He tells you, hey, you're going to suffer, right? This is your lot as a Christian. And this is what it's going to feel like. It's going to feel like you're in a fiery furnace. And it's going to feel like all of the junk is getting burned away from your heart, right? When you're reviled, because I'm just going to tell you, expect to be hated. Being honest with you, right? But how do I respond back? I revile not, but entrust myself to him who judges justly, just as Jesus did, right? You follow the way of your master. You follow the way of your example. Why am I saying all of this? What's my point? What is a point? What can you extract from that? You don't have to read my mind. You don't want to read my mind. It's a mess. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So pulling these things out ahead of time, being proactive, right? Preparing to suffer. Now, there's going to be, maybe I'll just do it this way. We know that there's suffering. We know there's manuals, separate little sub-manuals within the great manual of the Bible itself that teaches us how to deal with the fears of suffering correctly. We know they exist, but there's a balance to it all, right? And this leads to Flavel's second cause of sinful fear, which is confusion. He says confusion causes sinful fear. There's a balance to this, right? There's a balance to this idea that we are going to suffer and we need to prepare. It could be disproportionate to it. So Flavel, he speaks of the potential for us to rehearse historical persecutions over and over and over again in our minds as a way which we tend to feed our fears. So he refers to several historical examples. He speaks of the French and English Protestants in the time of the Reformation and the century after. And he speaks about how we have a tendency to dwell on these events to such an extent that it begins to create confusion in our mind, even about the promises of God. So, what he promises and what he doesn't. Again, fear is so good at getting us to focus on the sensual or the material circumstances or even the historical ones, so things that have happened in real time and space, that it distracts us from tempering those sensual and historical concerns with the promises of Scripture, right? Succinctly stated, we're focusing more on the fearful circumstances than we are on understanding the Scriptures, right? And he says that to avoid confusion and the fear that comes with it, we need to be able to sort of in a balanced way, or maybe an imbalanced way, concentrate more on the promises of God than the disastrous fears, right? And so we do want to acknowledge, just like the biblical writers, don't hide it from us. Jesus doesn't hide it from us. Hey, this is the name of the game if you're a Christian. You're going to suffer. I tell the story. We got some new folks. So I'm going to tell a story that you probably haven't heard before. I was going to one of my professors in seminary. He was my biblical counseling professor. He's a mentor of mine, a good friend of mine. And Julie and I went to meet with him about something. And his prayer that he prayed, so I'm going into ministry, right? I'm going to seminary. And the prayer that he prayed, he's like, Lord, thank you for Julie and John's willingness to die for the gospel. Right? And that was, you want to talk about a jolting prayer, right? And I'm like, that just doesn't feel really pastoral. And I'm scared now. Like, what do you, and we chuckle about it now. And, but I've gone on to see that when you look at the promises of Scripture, that's true. But that's not all that they say, right? They're very transparent about suffering. They're very transparent about the reality of fear, but they're always giving you hope in the midst of it. Here's how you deal with it. So Flavel goes on to talk about just some of the basic promises. He talks about his promises, or God's promises, that assure us of his sanctification in our troubles. God doesn't hide what he's doing. He may hide it in the specifics, very true. He doesn't hide it in what it is that we need to know. Hey, what are you doing here, God? I'm operating on you, right? I'm operating on you spiritually. It cuts, it hurts, it's painful at times. But that's what it is that I'm doing. And he doesn't just say, I'm going to leave you on the table, cut open for the rest of your life, right? No, there's going to be a healing that's occurring through the pain, right? Surgery is painful, but how do you feel when it's all healed up? A lot better, right? And he tells us that, Romans 8:28. He promises to be with us in our troubles, Psalm 92:15. His moderation of our troubles to a degree that we can endure. So I'm never going to give you anything that you can't endure. Right? I'm never going to lay that upon you in a way that you can endure. Isaiah 26. And his final deliverance of us from all our troubles. And isn't that what we look forward to? Revelation 7, that time at which he's going to wipe away all the tears from our eyes, right? And there will be no more sorrow. Those are all promises that are afforded to us. If you want some specifics, some takeaways, some homework, take a look at the book of 1 Peter. Read through it. It's 5 chapters. Fairly straightforward. The book of Hebrews, particularly the last 5 chapters of Hebrews is good. Romans 8, all good places to focus. So I want to pause, just take a breath, come up for air, and ask you guys if you have any questions or comments on what it is that we've said so far.
When we were talking last night, and I said about Holt's death,
Yeah.
that's our 4-year-old grandson, and I said, when I talked to the pastor, I said, I don't understand God's plan.
Yeah.
He was taken so young.
Right.
And he said, it's not for us to understand.
Right.
And I don't know, I had a hard time with that.
Yeah.
I felt like I do need to understand, but, that's what they say. It's not for us to understand.
Right.
It's God's plan.
Yeah. Did you guys hear that? Were you able to hear that? Okay. Yeah, and that's right. And then you also said what the pastor said back to you. You shared that struggle with him, and then what did he say back to you? Okay. Well, last night you had said something along the lines of him saying, well, it sort of, you're not the only one. You wouldn't be the first.
Yeah, he did say that. Lots of people in suffering and grief say that.
Right.
I don't understand why this happened.
Right. Yeah. And that's where I would draw back to and say, okay, maybe it's just presence that we focus on, right, as a way to, with each other, bringing community in with this to say, in the midst of situations that are harder to understand, we just remember God walks with us. He doesn't even sometimes say anything, but his presence is with us. We're not alone in that. And then other people just being with us, being present. Man, we had such a good conversation last night. I want to share some of it. but I'm like, I don't want to be too public, and it's videoed, and it's like, so. But one theme that I think we did hit on is just that power of presence, where Julie and I don't have to be in the same room, right? We're doing something in different rooms, but you know, we're not even together, like right next to each other. But if she's not there, I can sense that, right? I know that her presence is gone, and that's weird, right? That's uncomfortable. All of that to say that, maybe just dwelling on the fact that, okay, God is with me. God is with me. And there's always going to be this temptation to say, well, that's what the Bible says, but I don't feel any better. Like, that's not how, do you guys ever feel that? Oh, I went to John, I looked up First Peter, I read the whole book, I read it in Greek. I went to Hebrews, and even though it's written in Greek, I translated it into Hebrew, and I still don't feel any better about it, right? Do you guys ever feel that? Yeah. But then we talked about this last night too, a stretching into prayer, fighting, warrioring, right, in prayer. Keep praying, keep persevering. Lord, I don't sense your presence, right? You're not here. You said you would be, and I don't feel like I feel you. You think God is concerned? He's a big boy. He can take your cries, right? And in fact, maybe that's what he's trying to get you to do, to cry out, right? Remember, he answers Job when Job has it, or he's at it, right? I'm crying out to you, God. Where are you, right? And then God says essentially, now you're ready. Now I will answer you, right? So it could be that he's, again, sanctifying us, drawing these things out of us, drawing us closer to himself, getting him to realize that though you may not feel his presence, he is still present by faith. So in a sense, his presence is real irrespective of our faith. Our faith itself doesn't even dictate, right, the reality of his presence with us. So, but I feel like we could stop there and just think about that for, a while. Thank you for sharing that, Andy. I appreciate it. And I still want to marry your daughter after. So, yeah. Any other comments on that before we move along? Okay. Flavel then talks about immoderation. He says our immoderate or unbalanced love of life and its comforts and conveniences is another cause of sinful fear in times of trouble. He says if we loved our lives less, we would fear and tremble less. Okay. Now, don't get caught up on this. If we're supposed to like hate our lives, like, walk around bitter and be like this loathsome place to be. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. And let me get to that in just a second, okay? But he gives a biblical example of Paul, of course. Paul says in Acts 20, neither count I my life dear unto myself. Okay? In other words, my life, Paul says, is a commodity of little value in my eyes, not worth saving on such sinful terms. And Flavel says, oh, how many have parted with Christ, peace, and eternal life for fear of losing what Paul so little regarded. If we bring our thoughts nearer the matter, right, that's Flavel talking, obviously not me, we will find that this is a fountain of fear in times of danger. So think about, I don't necessarily say it right out loud, what are we afraid to lose? What worldly blessings occupy our hearts more than Christ himself? And these could even be very good blessings. Well, blessings aren't bad, right? By nature, I guess, definition. What good things occupy our heart, hold the place of our hearts more than Christ himself? I've come to see, just starting to see the truth of something that I read way back, right? But starting to see the reality now, and that's this, that all of Christian life is an exercise of the Lord prying the hands of our hearts free from all of our worldly blessings in order that they might be free to lay a hold of Christ himself, right? So everything that we're holding dear here, right, is slowly ripping away, not saying to hate them, not saying to not enjoy them, right, but to be free, right, to embrace him, right, when we see him face to face. So, if I come in the door, usually when I come in the door or come home or whatever, the boys are, dad, 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 or Julie comes in the door, mom, 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 so good to see you. And we always have something in our hands, right? There's always something in our hands. I could have a book bag, Julie could have a purse or something she's carrying from work, but we can't hug the kids until we put down everything that's in our hands, right? It's like that sort of idea. God is slowly prying those things away from us. Does this mean we don't enjoy worldly blessings and comfort? I was going to ask you that. Do you think it means that? No, of course not. The Lord gives us these things to enjoy. But I would say that it's really hard for us to truly enjoy it in its place if we don't have Christ in his proper place in our hearts at first. In fact, I've found oftentimes that I can be so, obsessed with holding on to what are even good things, right? That they don't even become enjoyable, right? It's like you have this inclination to take this good thing that God has given you and then, sort of screw up the joy of it all by just wanting to not use it, right? Or wanting more, yeah, or wanting more of it. Well, I don't have enough. I'm not content. I want more of that, right? But when we look up and we say, okay, there's my treasure, we can even experientially look back down and say, my treasure's taken care of, my love is taken care of. And you come back down in a posture that says, I'm not worried about holding on. I'm willing to let go. Now, how can I serve other people, right? How can I leave all of my causes and my cares to the one who loves me so that my life could be freed up to pour it out into other people, right? And if you think about it, that's exactly what Jesus does, and he did, and he still continues to do. So, the last cause, I think this is the last cause. Yeah, this is the last cause. Satan, the devil. Flavel says, I do not doubt that he, Satan, has, by God's permission, a great deal of influence upon people's imaginations and passions. He can raise far more terrible storms and tempests within than we ever felt without. By reason of his spiritual and angelic nature, he has immediate access to their internal senses. This appears, for instance, in diabolical dreams. By working on the imagination, he influences its passions and puts it under dreadful apprehensions and distractions. If he prevails, Flavel said, he drives them into temptation's snare as the fishermen and fowlers trap birds and fish in their nets, having flushed them out of the woods. I just want to take a quick satanic survey here. All right, so everybody's still awake. That's good. Quick survey of Satan. Raise your hand if you believe Satan is real. Is real, right? He's not just, he's all a little dude with a pitchfork that comes out around Halloween, right? He's real. He's real. Raise your hand if you believe he's a powerful force. Okay? So he's something to be reckoned with. Raise your hand if you believe he can do whatever he wants without the permission of God. Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, I mean, we just look. Let's just pull from the scriptures, right? We look at the book of Job, for instance, and Job says, he wants to give it to this Job guy, right? He's a good dude. He's a righteous man. I want to take him out, right? But he's always making that case to God. Hey, if you can, Job over here, you wonder why he hasn't cursed you because you made his life so easy, right? It's going really well. And so Satan is even raising the accusation to God, sort of implying to God, you don't know what you're doing, and this guy's going to fail, right, if you take everything away. That's quite arrogant. But I think, in fact, we really do, he cannot do anything irrespective of the sovereign permission of God. Why do I say that pastorally? Because no matter what you're going through and the evil temptations you may be enduring, you can be darn sure, we don't understand it, that this is not happening without the permission of a God who loves you. You're going to stop your kid from getting medical treatment that they need, even though it's going to hurt. Very small example, Colin, I'm going to pick on you. Colin hates shots, right? He hates getting shots, but he goes to get them. I don't like having to do something that Colin doesn't like, right? Because it's painful for him. You can debate all day long. It's not a paper, it doesn't matter. I don't like seeing my kid hurt, but it's for his good. He needs it, right? And it's the same. I've given my permission for my son to go and have a particular immunization or whatever. And I know it's going to hurt him, but it's whatever for his best. Please don't make this a debate about should I get immunized or not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm a pastor. I'm talking about spiritual things here, and so. But you carry the analogy carries. Satan cannot do anything to you without the permission of God. And you know that God's always working for your good, right? He's the parent that's letting you go into the doctor's office to get that immunization, okay? All right. Now, I'm going to ask you again. Raise your hand if you believe that we ignore Satan too much in our thinking, especially in Reformed thinking. Do we ignore him too much? Okay, good. I was a little nervous about that. Okay. And then let me ask you, if you do, why do you think that's the case? Why do we ignore him too much in our thought? Why? Yes. Yeah, which in it, so did you guys hear all of that? So essentially Wyatt is saying like we're a little bit fearful of just pawning off our sinful behaviors, and Satan made me do it, right? I think that's right. We should be, right? But the balanced perspective is we already have this, it looks most often like this. We already have this sinfulness inside of us. And Satan is a master at knowing our weaknesses. And he will manipulate those things, right? He will draw out, oh, this person's particularly prone to anger. This person is particularly prone to lust. This person is particularly prone to pride. What can I orchestrate, right? And make it look really good. By the way, Satan dresses up things. He just, right? Like he dresses up these things and subtly works, slowly, and stirs up those things which are already inside of you. He's a manipulator in those forms. Why else? Why do you think we might short sell him in Reformed thinking? Chase.
We're both systematic and also we really emphasize strongly the gravity of our own souls.
Right.
So at least for me, it's sort of easy to look at this whole doctrine of gravity and say, I don't even know what Satan needs to do here. It seems like his job's kind of already done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it almost feels sometimes that we don't need a category. It does need.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Susan and then Lucas. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And so I think that's a good term. And I think that can be characteristic of sometimes our way of thinking, even as Reformed people, to say, I've said it a number of times and usually in private conversations, but we have a tendency as a way of thinking to overreact to the opposite extreme, right? So anything that looks like, a misapplication of the doctrine of Satan, we just want to say, no, it's all the flesh. That's the answer. Because then we have no opportunity, right, to think wrongly about a particular doctrine, right? So we just say the right answer is to just always be overly critical about everything, right? It's right-hearted, right? Because we don't want to get things wrong. We do take doctrine seriously, unapologetically. But at the same time, there can be some practical consequence to that as well. So very good. Lucas, I'd say you're next.
I think we have a tendency, especially in a culture society, to over-rationalize things and dismiss spiritual.
Okay, and particularly in what societies?
First world society.
Okay.
Richer countries like the United States have a tendency we try to make everything rational and not believe in its spiritual realities.
Yeah. Right, and I agree with that. And I would say that the whole there is that one can not you at all, but we would even say, well, I'm being rational, but a component of rationalism is that there's a logical premise that's rooted in truth, right? You may not agree with it, that's a separate issue. But I can believe in Satan and be rational at the same time, right? I can reason. Look, I reason and I'm rational because my knowledge base, my immediate first logical premise is the fact that the Bible tells me that Satan is real, right? I believe in that, and from there I can reason. But I very much agree with you in terms of that mystical probably need to be careful how we define that. We're not, as I said last week, we're not people who are on a sanctified acid trip, right? That's not necessarily what we're saying. It's not how we define mystical, but there is a mysterious existential experience that we go through as human beings. You can't discount that, right? And remembering too that it's a spiritual realm, right? So mystical isn't just the elusive experience with Satan. It's also too, in a sense, right, a spiritual experience with the Holy Spirit, right, himself. So, all right, very good. I saw another hand. Mercy or Wyatt, did some say? Yep.
Probably combine, as you said, different people are inclined to different temptations.
Yep.
Satan is a master psychologist. There's a sense where at the one of the tactics that we are not inclined to.
Mm.
To some extent, these people are not going to be the kind that say, well, the devil did it. So let's just make them think only about this enemy, their own sin, flesh, and neglect thinking about me.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
there's a sense where that probably is part of that play.
No.
If I can't manipulate how you think about me, then don't think about me.
Yeah.
Let me manipulate how you think about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it sort of feels a little bit like, okay, the greatest thing that the devil ever did was convincing people that God doesn't exist. So I think the greatest trick he's ever performed is saying he doesn't exist, right? It's just a cartoon. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. A lot of discussion on Satan this morning. All right, look, practically speaking, and in terms of our relationships with one another, did Jesus ever make distinctions in terms of his compassion on people, whether or not this was a satanic attack or whether this is attributed to your sinful flesh? Okay, elaborate. So. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point, right? So he's spiritually discerning. He's saying the leaders are the greatest example. The religious leaders. He's very different with the religious leaders, right? They're right. So he's discerning their hearts, okay, and then he's looking at somebody who is demonically oppressed, and he has compassion upon them and dealing with them in very different ways. It was somewhat of a leading question, and I appreciate you saying that, why, because it made me realize I needed to clarify it a little bit more. Does anybody remember when Jesus is looking out on the multitudes? He feeds the 4,000 and the 5,000, right? And the scriptures, definitely in Mark, I think it's probably in Luke too, say that Jesus has compassion on them, right? For they were like sheep without a shepherd. And you read and you dig more into the Gospels, and hopefully we're seeing it in our sermon series of Mark, is that the picture that's being painted there is that people were acting incredibly sinfully at the time of Jesus, right? The non-religious leaders. But interacting with that, right, was the misguidance of the religious leaders, right? They were holding them back. Remember the sermon, how in the temple they had set up all of these shekels and sacrifices so that people couldn't commune with God in prayer. God desired to know them, to call in the Gentiles. They were to come to him for mercy and forgiveness, but let me block you from all of that by all of this commerce we're doing in the temple, right? So they're setting up these systems so that they can't have communion with God. And Christ, so in a sense, you could say that the multitudes were sort of feeding into I would argue, the demonic teachings of the religious leaders at the time, causing them to sin even more. And what's Jesus' response in that instance? Compassion, right? The compassion on the demoniac, right? Who's doing really wicked things, right? And then the compassion on your average, ordinary, run-of-the-mill sinner like Peter, right? What's Jesus' response to Peter's repentance? You idiot. And what's Peter's response? Satan made me do it. No. Peter's sorry, right? He did not listen to Jesus. Satan did take advantage of him. And Jesus was like, what? should have known better, right? No, Jesus is like, you're forgiven. That was a tangent. That was totally a tangent there. And that's what Satan will do, right? He'll get you on a tangent. I want to move in. I want to begin, just to keep us on track, of talking about the effects of sinful fear. This is part 3 in your outline. The effects of sinful fear. What does it do to us practically? How does it show up in our lives? Flavel calls them the deplorable effects of sinful fear. And the first one that he says, the first one he alludes to, is distraction. And we alluded to this one in the first 2 lessons, so I'm going to be really brief with this one. Flavel says that much fear creates tumult, chaos in the soul. It puts everything into hurries and distractions to such an extent that we cannot perform any service for God with profit or comfort. He goes on to say, I do not doubt that it is one of the devil's great designs to keep us in continual fear and alarm, and to puzzle our heads and hearts with 1,000 difficulties which will probably never come upon us. Even if they do, Flavel says, they will never prove as fatal as we imagine. He does this to unfit us for present duties and to destroy our comfort in them. And so he goes on to speak of the duty, calls it a duty, of recalling past deliverances and how fear distracts us from being able to do this. He says, Satan severs us from the comfort that's found in our past experiences and the relief that God's faithfulness and goodness imparted in former straits and dangers. Fear clouds them all. We give so much attention to people and dangers that we forget God, even the God who preserved us when the enemy was ready to devour us. Our distracting fears cut us off from these sweet reliefs when we need them the most. So Flavel says there's a duty, right? Which he's saying, hey, a duty in the Puritan mind is something that you're obligated to do, right? It's a spiritual exercise. It's a matter of the will. Whether you feel like it or not, this is something that we ought to practice and develop. Habits we ought to cultivate. And just sort of applying that, right, in the real and the regular here. Sometimes it's helpful to keep a record of your life, especially as a Christian. What I mean, a record of our life. Journals, right? Writings of some sorts, whatever that may look like. And one thing that it will allow you to do is to go back and see how God's been faithful to his promises throughout your life. So doing kind of like a journal review. Take some time to just glance back every day at certain points if you need to, every month, once a year, every decade. Observe the actual instances of deliverance, right? Simply marvel at where you were and think about where God has brought you. So I was looking at the first journal I ever did was, it was in 1995. 1995, I was looking at the date this morning, I think it was like July 30th of 1995 or something like that. And I haven't done it consistently over, but I still do it to this day, right? Get a stack of journals. And it's funny to go back and look at some of these things. You got to be careful because it can be a very challenging exercise too. Going to the past can sometimes be hurtful. But one thing I noticed is that, like, who's that guy, right? I wouldn't think like that now, right? How did I get from there to here? And I look at the circumstances and the experiences, right? And the low points, and I'm like, how am I here, right? How am I here being able to teach and to preach the gospel to people, right? How does that even happen? Grace. That's it. And there were so many fearful times throughout as many years, and I'm sure all of you can identify, right? Where you're just like, I don't know how I made it down that one. I was in a moment where I felt like when I was in the moment, this is it. I'm done, right? We're through. It's over. Like, that's it, right? And then you look at yourself now, and you look at your circumstances now, and you're like, oh, there is a God. He is gracious. He's good. And if he has done this, not once, not twice, not 3 times, for decades, builds confidence, right? He's going to keep on doing it. He's going to continue to be faithful. If you're not really a journaler, but you like the idea of looking on people's experiences in their lives and seeing how God has changed them, I would encourage you, pick up the journals of other, or letters. Even letters are really good, of really notable saints, right? On our I love these things in our living room, on our bookshelf. I have things like the journals of George Whitefield, right? These are his personal journals. The letters of John Newton, the letters of John Calvin, the letters of Martin Luther, right? Why do I have the letters? Why do I have the journals? Because all of these guys are brilliant pastors, brilliant theologians, like unparalleled minds and unparalleled hearts and care for people, but they're also very human. They've gone through their own experiences. And if you want to find the develop of somebody's sanctification or Christian character over time, read their letters to people, right? Read the journals of their own experiences. Fascinating exercise. And you'd be really encouraged by some of these too. Be like, oh, this spiritual giant, wow, like he went through that, right? God delivered him from that, or he thought that way, or he did that sort of thing, and look how God delivered him, right? He can deliver me too. Paul, in the book of either 1st or 2nd Timothy chapter 1, Paul says, look, I'm the worst dude on the planet. I killed Christians, right? Or I approved of their murders, right? But God saved me by his grace. Why? So that Christ Jesus would, in me, demonstrate his patience with all who would come to believe in him. In other words, like, man, God saved that guy who killed the people that he's now serving, right, by his grace, and now he's preaching love and grace. He can certainly help a wretch like me, right? He's not running around killing Christians. The second effect that it has, being vulnerable to temptation. So fear lures us away from remembering and abiding in the knowledge of God's protection. We alluded to this. Flavel says, the subtle enemy of our salvation knows that we are out of gunshot range when we abide with God in the way of our duty. So when we're walking close to the Lord. The Lord is with us while we are with him. Satan cannot attempt to ruin us while we are under the wings of God's protection. To do anything to us, he must first force us out from under those wings. Nothing does this more effectively than fear. When we move from that shelter, we are like birds wandering from their nests. Notice how fear in this quote has a destination in mind. Well, we've talked about this before. While fear is full of deceit, delusion, and chaos, it somehow still has a trajectory, right? A goal in mind. And it's the goal of drawing us out of our communion with God. Look, a young child is safest when they're closest to his or her parents, right? That's where in the arms of the protection, under the wings of their parents. But we're vulnerable, right? When we go out from under those wings, and fear can do that. I would also say, just in the practical, again, pay attention to your thoughts throughout the day. Paul talks about taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. When does the hurried state start? When does the fearful state start? Do you notice patterns in your own thought and life where you're just like, hey, what's the trigger? What's the fiery dart, right? What is the specific circumstance that always leads me down this sort of crap? I'm stuck in the slough of fear now. Pay attention to those thoughts, right? Observe them, jot them down, pray through them, so that you observe the fear the instant that it takes place under the wings of God, right? Before it drives you out from under his wings, right? That's the objective. Okay. Secondly, fear chips away at our patience. Geez, this is true. Fear makes you tired, right? And it makes, Flavel said, fear makes people impatient while waiting for God's time and method of deliverance. It discourages the soul and drives it into the next temptation snare. It says, the captive exile hasteneth that he may be loosed, and that he should not die in the pit. Isaiah 51:14. According to fear, any means of escape is better than lying in the pit. But God will, as we said earlier, provide a way out of temptation. It's a promise of his. Perhaps in fearing, we should learn to pray more often, something like this: give me to wait upon you while you provide my deliverance, right? Hey, Augie, how are you? Aurora, good to see you. I shared that last week. Almost every prayer I prayed this. Lord, I'm praying for all these things, but I also want you to answer this prayer. Probably most important. I'm good to wait, but I need you to give me to wait while I wait upon you, right? To provide for my deliverance. I know you will. The reality is, as I go along here, I'm going to get tested. I need you to help me even wait, right? I'm good with that. Just help me to do it. And then lastly, fear can lead to cowardice and apostasy, he says. And I combined these two because at the end of the day, there are overlap. That's to say that cowardice, if we continuously cowered in the face of opposition to our faith, we're going to end up apostatizing or rejecting the Christian faith altogether. Flavel says, in the scriptures, it, that is fear, is frequently joined with discouragement. Fear not, neither be discouraged, Deuteronomy 1:21. Let not your hearts be faint. Fear not, and do not tremble. Neither be ye terrified because of them, Deuteronomy 20. And it's also coupled with dismay, Deuteronomy 31, and also a faint heart, Isaiah 7. How dangerous, Flavel says, it is to have courage extinguished and the faintness of heart strengthened when we have great need of courage. Let me ask you a question, and we're going to just I'm just going to end up wrapping up here. Can anyone think of how we as Christians today might be tempted to cower, sort of to deny our faith in some way, shape, or form? What does that look like? What would that look like? Mercy. Okay.
Differences, whether it's political things, not there's a lot of just paper, so many people have so much, more social pressure to access the very voice. There is a lot more fear to be abnormal, to be associated, I think, in some regards, that tout the name of Christ to not walk the faith, and that's what oftentimes Christian. Like if you're good, not be associated with that.
Right.
Or how do you push back because how do you claim Christ and then try to clarify that being a Christian is not being a false person.
Yeah.
And then I think there's all the arguing online, all heated conversations, there's so much debate, so much
Yeah.
it feels, and even then it's like, I feel like in many regards it's a loud minority. They're very loud. And they will come for you. And
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Spot on. Did you guys hear all that? And I see a lot of heads shaking, and you're feeling that pressure as well. Yeah, just a plug again for the book of First Peter. Social ostracization is essentially what you're saying, right? That social outcasting. Nobody is, as at this point in time, hanging us from crosses, right? Setting us on fire. All the crazy stuff that you read in the first couple of centuries of the church and the 17th and 16th century of the church. That's not happening. But there are, certain cultural beliefs are operating up here. And if you're believing this over here, maybe you get passed over for this job, right? Or maybe you just don't fit there. My conscience won't let me do this. Well, you can participate in that, right? Even just more basic, right? Relationships, right? I just had to talk to somebody very close to me this week who was just ousted online out of ignorance, absolute ignorance about what it is that they think, what it is that they believe, right? And that stuff's all on there publicly, right? And so, it's just like, boy, that just destroys relationships, right? Because of the ignorance, the misunderstanding, the assumptions that are being made about our beliefs. And keep in mind, behind of it all, I don't care what anybody says, behind it all is there. It could be out of ignorance, it could be out of whatever. But there is either you are for God and His Christ, or you are against God and His Christ. There's no neutral ground, right? Irrespective of what people may say, right? Jesus says, you're either for me or you're against me, right? You're on one side or another, to one degree or another. But there aren't multiple sides that we're selecting from, right? And that hostility is more open now socially than it ever has been for us. Yeah.
And it's like, and that you feel so comfortable to say that out loud.
Right.
So many people feel comfortable to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the word. Yeah. We hit. Very true. Which way do I want to go? But we've already won. It's not that we will win. Our victory will become an ultimate reality in the return of Christ. We just need to wait in that confidence, right? So, irrespective of the social hatred or the relational hatred or the physical manifestations of that hatred, we are the victors, right? We are more than conquerors through Him who loved us, right? And we need to remember that even more strongly as we see these fears all the more present online, in our lives, in our relationships, and so forth. So, that about wraps it up for today. I think we're actually going to finish next week, which is super cool in my mind. We set a 6-week series. We're going to finish in 6 weeks. That's awesome. I think that's a record for us at Veto, so that's cool. Glad you guys can join us. Glad you're here. I assume none of you are just staying for just Sunday school.